Right. Like it's scrubbing up a little bit, so then you know a decade or so. Like it's useful because you can more accurately. Definitely simple. Or it might be more than I actually
Okay, we're going to get started here. Just a couple of announcements. First of all, if you haven't got one of these, this is the evaluation. We really do appreciate if you can fill these out. We actually do read these and compile them and try and make this a better event for you. So if you could fill it out, and also make sure you put your name at the bottom to be eligible for the raffle prizes at the end. I guarantee there's some really good things that you want to get. Other items? Yes?
Where do we have them in?
Good question. We will be taking them by the, we'll have someone here to collect them at the end, and also when we do the closing ceremonies. So a couple of places for you.
Do you have to be present to win the raffle?
You do have to be present to win the raffle, sorry. But we will be doing that right after this. So stick around. Other announcements, obviously, please put your phone on silent if you haven't already. And the after event, the social networking event, has changed venues. We're going to be doing this at Catalyst instead of Mead Hall, which is what we originally announced. And that information will repeat again at the closing ceremony. So we'd love to have you join us for some appetizers and cocktails afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John McDonald from EMC, who's going to talk about next generation incident management. John works in the CTO's office, focusing on privacy solutions. And I will let him continue from there. Thank you.
Yeah. Everyone hear me? Whoa. Yeah. Move that down a little bit. How's that? Better? No, it's not.
All right, heck with it. I'll stop. Everyone hear me in the back okay? Can you guys hear me back? The video won't hear you. You can turn the gain down a little bit.
It's actually the feedback on the two mics. So
Yeah. Testing. Better? Cool. Okay. So my name is John McDonald. I'm not sure where Dan got the idea of working in the CTO's office. I work with the CTO's office once in a while, no problem. I actually work for a group called Trust Solutions Team. And you'll notice my tag there says EMC/RSA. Who I work for pretty much depends on which day of the week it is. I'm one of the few people with one foot in both sides of the house. And the subject we're talking about, real fast, IT industry, primarily security for about 35 years now, a lot of consulting and that sort of thing. I've been with EMC for about 13 years now. If you do the math on the RSA acquisition, you realize my first 4 or 5 years at EMC, I was one of about 3 people that could spell the word security at the time. Our global security office was like 2 people. But anyway, so I transitioned to RSA, did some consulting, a bunch of other stuff. But what we're going to talk about today is based on a lot of work we've done at EMC Consulting and just conversations with customers and what we see happening in the industry. Next generation incident management. How many immediately replace the word management with response in your head? Right? Bunch of you, right? They all think incident response. One of the first points, and you saw the previous, or you were in the previous section about the interactions between marketing and security. One of the things you as security professionals absolutely need to do is market yourself to your organization and to upper management, mid-level management, anyone in the organization. Incident management sounds a lot better than incident response does. So start thinking in terms of how do you make this stuff and what you're trying to do more palatable to the people that write the checks that let you do it. All right, so we're going to talk about incident management. We're going to do a quick overview. We'll talk about what it is you really should think about. Is it an incident or is it not an incident? We'll look at the process. We'll look at what's necessary around people and expertise. Some of the supporting technologies. What do you need to make a kind of a more modern incident management program work? We'll take a look at what you need to learn when this happens, and then a quick summary. How many of you would pretty much think this is the way you guys currently do incident management? Anyone? And by the way, Eustace originally said disaster recovery works just as well for incident response, right? I can't tell you how many organizations, how many customers I've worked with that think incident response is stand up a war room, have a meeting, right? That's to them as, my God, we've been penetrated. We've got to go off and management run around screaming and people doing that sort of stuff. We can't afford that anymore. We'll talk about why. One of the biggest reasons, and I don't know if anyone's seen the ESG study that came out last month, incredibly useful study. One of the really interesting things, how many of you work in organizations with more than 5,000 people? Wow, a lot of hands go up. What they, based on the survey, what they found is those organizations average somewhere around 3 to 4 attacks a week. And when I say attack, I don't mean just a broad-based network scan. I mean somebody tries to get into their infrastructure. That's 3 to 4 a week. At EMC, that's about the rate we face. And I've done a lot of discussions with our global security office people. We face a lot of ongoing attacks on a regular basis. What that means is, guess what? We do incident response on an ongoing, regular basis. We can't afford to stand up war rooms all the time. The other interesting point, 28% of those attacks were targeted specifically at the organization being attacked. That means someone wrote custom malware. That means someone did a little bit of spear phishing to try to get access into that organization. It's becoming so much easier for anyone out there to launch a targeted attack. Anyone want to guess what the absolute most favorite tool for most hackers is initially before they start the attack? Social media, right? LinkedIn. I learned the name of all your executives. You know, Twitter, Facebook. I learned who's going to be on vacation, where they are, what they're doing. That's a godsend of information if I'm trying to break into your organization, right? It makes it a lot easier to do targeted attacks. So what are we doing to try to stop these? We're talking about incident management here, right? So one of the assumptions is that your preventative controls didn't work if you've got an incident management process going on. We have anyone here, by the way, willing to make the claim that you are confident you can keep 100% of all attacks?
EMP.
Good point. Denial of service, all right? I've worked with a lot of security professionals back in my consulting days that would never go to their management and say, guys, I can't promise you I'll keep the bad guys out. God, if I told my management that, they'd fire me in a heartbeat and get someone that would promise it, right? Everyone here knows you can't do that anymore. And one of the reasons, and I don't know, anyone here know Brian is Senior Vice President of Information Security at Symantec, in the Wall Street Journal last year, publicly admitted something everyone here in this room's known for years, right? If you're lucky, AV stops half of the stuff trying to get into your environment. Anyone here, how many of you think you're lucky if it stops 20 or 30%, right? At lower. AV, the trouble is, if you look at most organizations, you ask the question, what's your primary mechanism for keeping malware out of your environment? Antivirus. We scan everything. Well, okay, so you're roughly going to keep half of the stuff out, right? The reality is that stuff's got to get in. You've got to be able to handle it quickly and efficiently. So let's take a look at kind of the anatomy of a breach these days. One thing I want to mention, incident management, folks, we have to get out of the thought process that incident management or incident response starts as soon as you detect the problem. It doesn't. It starts as soon as the problem begins in your environment. The gap between the time the initial penetration occurs and the time you detect it, that's a problem with your controls. But it's still part of the incident management process, right? You've got to be able to quickly detect, quickly recover, those sorts of things. And here again, a lot of organizations out there don't think this way because they're spending boatloads of money on preventative tools, IDS, IPS, SIM, antivirus to keep the bad guys out, right? The reality is, anyone here ever done social engineering testing and done the old drop a USB drive in the parking lot of the building? Right, yeah, very common thing. I've had 95% plus success rate penetrating environments that way, right? It's just so incredibly easy to do. The bad guys are going to get in no matter what you do. Your goals are, how fast can I detect them, and then how quickly can I recover? So we're not going to talk a lot about this initial part because it involves, next second generation malware detection and security analytics. I'll briefly mention that. But we're going to focus on what you want you detected. But don't ever believe that your responsibility starts as soon as it's detected. Incident management starts as soon as it begins occurring in the environment. So how many of you would say that's a fairly accurate representation of your security budget? And when people spend most of their money on preventative controls, right? Keeping the bad guys out of the environment. The shift we need to make is to the idea that we still want, if AV's keeping 55% of the stuff out of my environment, that's a couple million pieces of noise level crap I don't have to worry about, right? We're not saying get rid of antivirus. But I want to go from a couple of security tools and regularly reviewing the event logs to I want to collect every event log from every asset everywhere in my infrastructure, every database, every network switch. Because guess what? That USB dropped in the driveway in the parking lot trick immediately bypasses all those perimeter controls I've got. If I'm not paying attention to what's happening inside, they've already got through my perimeter, and I don't know what's going on. I need to collect and monitor event logs from everything, and I need to have a push-button incident response, fix the problem, move on, next problem situation. And that requires an investment. It is no longer, my God, we've got malware, call Steve up over in the corner and get him over here and have him figure out what to do, right? Question?
The two pies are the same size. Is this assuming that the budget for your suggested increase in monitoring and response come out of essentially waste in the prevention bucket or budget, or are you assuming a larger pie, a larger budget overall?
So his question is does this assume a larger pie? I would say better than half of the time. You mentioned the term waste in the preventative budget. How many of you here have security controls that are shelfware? There's always, right? Everyone buys stuff and they don't use it. So yes, there's inevitably some plain existing budget, but part of it too is hopefully once we get through this session, you understand these pieces better and not just understand it from a technical perspective, but how to communicate them. It becomes a lot easier to management, make the case, guys, we're not doing a good enough job here. We need to make some investment. So it's generally a mix of the two, right? So I'm going to be handing out some axioms as we go through here. Axiom number 1. If incident response takes more than 24 hours, folks, you ought to start considering it an autopsy. Does that absolutely mean the company's got to die after 24 hours? No. But it becomes progressively harder to recover and more expensive to recover the longer it goes on. I'll give you an example. We called in an incident response a couple years ago for a customer out in the Midwest. We found out their environment had been compromised for over 2 years before they figured out. When I say compromised, the attackers had created their own AD domain admin accounts in the environment, right? And the funny part is the company is still in business because they made the decision to say, well, we're not really going to tell our customers or anyone in the public that this sort of thing happened. The attackers had modified the source code on the customer's products to build in backdoors for them, but they never told the customer about it because they made a decision to not go public with it, so they survived as a business. If they had gone public with that, good chance they wouldn't be in business today. Incident response has to be a fast, continuous process. Second axiom. How many of you would consider yourself technical geeks? Yeah, everyone, right? We're all kind of frustrated CSIs. We want to collect all the evidence. We want to collect all the clues. We want to, decompose, deconstruct the malware, and figure out what it does. Your first focus needs to be, how do I get the business back up and running quickly? That should be your primary job. Does that mean you shouldn't do all the detailed forensics? No, but only as they don't interfere with getting the organization back up and functional again. Right? If you're, concerned about decomposing this executable that you found out there and tracing it back to the, internet cafe, the specific terminal over in Bosnia somewhere, are you guys planning on taking legal action? No? Then you don't need that information. Know when to stop. It's tough from a technical perspective because we all want to do it. We all enjoy doing it. We're not saying don't do it. Just make sure it does not interfere with you getting the business back up and running. That's what incident response needs to be about. So there's kind of three broad components you need to look at. People's, the right skills, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and I'm going to be talking more about each of these. And probably the most absolute important one, I'm sure everyone here can relate to, appropriate authority. Who is it that gets blamed when a security breach occurs? Security, right? Who is it, that went to that stupid wrong website and clicked that wrong link, some end user? Who was it that accidentally opened up that port in the firewall, the networking team? Who was it that accidentally turned on the anonymous FTP server, the server IT team, right? But you're the one that gets blamed. So we'll talk more about that. Process. Everyone here has processes, some of them more structured than others, but they're important because they need to be repeatable. And as I said, we'll talk more about that, but the important question to ask yourself, if you are the primary incident management, incident response person in your organization, you or there's a group of you, ask yourself, if all of us quit tomorrow and moved down to Florida and opened a deep sea fishing business and they had to hire 2 or 3 new people, how quickly could they come back up to speed on what you were doing? If your entire operation is based on, I know Steve over there, I know who to call for those, sir, got a bunch of post-it notes underneath my keyboard with information on it. That's not a structured process. And the coolest bit's the technology. What tools do I need to pull this off with? As I said, we'll go into these in a little more detail. So what is an incident? I'm not necessarily going to go through specifically this type, that type, that type. But what I want to focus on is helping you understand the need for you to clearly define clearly communicate what an incident is. And this is a sample of, is this NIST? I forget. I pulled this off of some example. I've used probably 30 different combinations of terms with different customers. Everyone, if you ever try to get into a discussion with another security professional over the best way to describe different types or levels of incidents, bring plenty of beer, because that's worse than asking someone what the best encryption algorithm is, right? It's inevitably going to result in a fight. This is just one example, basic incident. Guys, we think something is wrong. Confirmed incident. Guys, we know something's wrong. We got evidence. We found a piece of malware. We found an open port in our firewall. Something's happening, right? Critical incident. All right? We know problems are occurring in our environment. Someone's penetrated, someone's gained control. And finally, and probably the most important distinction, separate all these out from the concepts of a breach. Penetration, incident, whatever means somebody got in. Breach means they accomplished their goals and you now have a significant legal liability. Right? And does anyone here know their lawyers in the organization, know the legal team fairly well? A couple of you, yeah, you might have worked with us. But the reality is once a breach occurs, that's the time, call in the lawyers. They need to be in the driver's seat. Because there's all kinds of legal ramifications for everything you do from the point that you discovered that breach, right? So whatever terms you decide to use, it is very important. And by the way, this is the HIPAA definition, and I like their definition of a breach better than anybody's because it says exactly that. A breach means that healthcare information has been taken out of the organization and improperly disclosed to somebody. So look to HIPAA. Yeah, look to the U.S. government, I know. But the important point, you've got to clearly define each of those different levels, and you've got to clearly communicate, because you will be explaining to upper management, you will be explaining to IT, you will be explaining to legal, you will be explaining to marketing what's going on. And if, you've got an incident, you end up having to spend 20 minutes in every conversation explaining what you mean by an incident, you're going to run out of time quickly. So develop consistent definitions, and I know this is a 4-letter word for most of you probably, but document them. Anyone here besides me enjoy doing documentation? There's always one or two weirdos like us out there. It's absolutely critical. I don't mean, when I say documentation, please do not think I mean an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, right? Document means put it down, a wiki. A wiki's a great idea. Please make sure it's adequately protected so the attackers can't get in and look at everything, obviously. Make sure everyone's on the same page, and most importantly, don't just send them a pointer to the wiki, or don't send them a copy. Say, guys, here's our incident definitions, and you get that reply, okay, I'll take a look at them. Great. No. Get someone to sign on the bottom. Yes, everyone that's read this agrees this is how we're going to discuss incidents. Because without that acknowledgement, a month down the road, you're going to start throwing these terms around. Everyone's going to look at you like you're crazy. New person joins the organization, make sure they understand what this stuff means. So you've got to communicate it, you've got to get buy-in for it. The process. Ooh, that's loud. So you get events and alerts. And as I said, incidents start the second your environment is compromised, not the time you detect it, right? And you've got tools out there. How many of you are running SIM systems? Most of you probably have one. How many are doing newer security analytics type systems? Very couple, fewer hands typically. And by the way, the difference is typically SIM systems more often than not use some sort of defined rules. If A or B then C, then tell me about it. Analytics systems tend to be based more on big data type solutions and use expert system for correlation in the background. Both have pros and cons. SIMs are better for smaller environments. But if you've got more than 100 servers in your environment, you start turning on for event logs for everything. How well do you think your SIM system is going to keep up and consuming, potentially tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of events per minute, right? That's why you kind of need to look at more next generation type solutions. But the idea is to A, identify something as potentially wrong. And that's where your level zeros are going to come in. These are the people, and keep in mind, level zero's job is not to prove that something's wrong. Their job is to confirm that it's not a false positive, right? They aren't the ones that go out there and say, oh yeah, we've got a significant security problem here. They're the ones that get that alert and say, oh nope, that's that idiot that forgot to submit the change control request. This is okay, right? That's filtering out false positives. That's what level zero is primarily about. The next piece says, guys, we have got an incident. We go through an investigation. From level 0 goes up to level 1, right? That's where a lot of you probably typically come into play. We've got this set of situations or this circumstance happening here we need to take a closer look at. Your ability to do this quickly goes back to what I originally talked about, the concept of SIMs. One of the biggest problems we typically find, anyone here basically feel overwhelmed with the volume of information you receive from your security tools on a regular basis, right? It's too much. Anyone here, you guys remember, anyone here from Target? I don't want to pick on them if they're in the room. One of the things that came out of the Target breach, their SecOps team trying to look through roughly 60,000 events a day. Anyone here have enough eyes on glass to do that? That's where that whole analytics theme comes into play. So now, when you get that individual alert, you don't have to go over here and start looking through every other tool and every other network stream and everything else and try to put the picture together yourself. Analytics type tools are designed to correlate all that together and say, here's 27 related events. Take a look at these. Right? So that's just, once again, the ability to do this quickly is absolutely critical. You do a quick investigation, and once again, you realize, no, this was some stupid sysadmin that accidentally turned on anonymous FTP on this server, right? Call them up, tell them to turn it off, close the incident, you're done. On the other hand, it's a confirmed incident. We found a piece of malware. We found a compromised identity of the environment. What do we do next? Is it critical? Yes, critical means generally it addresses or it impacts some form of critical asset in your environment. And we're going to talk more about the concept of classification here in a second, but if it's a critical incident, you're probably under attack, right? So your next step really should be, how do I minimize the impact of this? I've identified a piece of malware. I've identified it on 4 different systems in my environment. Can I shut the malware down? How many of you would probably try something like that? Stop the executable, right? Anyone here ever heard of something called Rombertick? Just came out last week. Rombertick's got this cute little trick where if you try to shut it down or examine it, it immediately deletes the MBR for the system it's running on and starts deleting all the data on the system. Right? So you need to understand what you're doing, but you need to try to contain it at that point. Blocking network ports, disabling user accounts, shutting systems down if you have to. You have to contain it and fix the problem. That gets into things like the ability to quickly restore systems. We'll talk a little bit more about that also. But at this point, You're assuming somebody got in the environment, but you're also kind of assuming that nothing got out, right? On the other hand, you found a event log out there that says, guys, a whole bunch of files were FTP'd out of our environment. The absolute first thing you need to do, like I said, is call the lawyers. Legal people need to be in the driver's seat from this point on, because everything you do is going to be potentially examined in court, in public opinion, by marketing. The legal people need to start making decisions in this case. And anyone here want to guess what that implies? It implies that you've got legal people that actually understand this stuff, right? I'll give you an example. We got called in on incident response a couple years back by a local company here in Boston area. Seeing a lot of strange activity. We took a look at some logs, looked at their SIM system at the time. We identified, yeah, there's something strange going on here. We found some malware on one of the systems in their environment. Yeah, you guys have been penetrated. So they're, oh my God, what do we do? Well, let's take a little bit more look. We'll do some containment. We found some FTP files that showed somebody had copied a whole bunch of Excel spreadsheets, zipped them together, encrypted them, and sent them out of the environment. Went back to the customer and said, guys, this should transition from a penetration to a breach. Customer freaks out even worse, running around, help, what do we do? What do we do? Told them that exact thing. Guys, step number one, call your legal department. We called up their legal department, spent about 10 minutes explaining what the problem was. After about 30 seconds of silence, and by the way, getting a lawyer to be quiet for 30 seconds is a trick by itself. But anyway, after about 30 seconds of silence, the guy on the other end said, we don't have anyone here that knows anything about that stuff. Fine, what do you want us to do? He said, don't touch anything till we get someone in here. We spent 3 more days watching the attackers move around the environment, just trying to contain them until they got a legal consultant in, right? You have to be prepared to support this stuff. What's the impact? And here again, you folks, you're data custodians, right? You're not data owners. Those are business people. They need to make the decisions about impact, not you. And what happens from that point on, obviously, is a data breach. Do you have to notify somebody? Do you have to update your resume? Whatever, right? So it's a fairly straightforward process, but here again, it needs to be documented. It needs to be communicated. And everybody needs to understand their roles and responsibilities clearly. And here again, we'll talk more about that. So let's take a look at some of the people and expertise involved in this. So the cool thing is that incident management isn't just for security professionals anymore. It takes a village, right? There's no way that you as a single security person can basically effectively do incident management all by yourself. It's impossible. Any even moderately medium-sized organization just has too many moving parts for you to take responsibility for everything, right? So as I said, the process, the terms need to be developed, need to be documented, need to be communicated. And you need to train people. Anyone here ever think tossing a document over a wall to someone is an effective way to get them to understand what it means? Probably not, right? Have regular training. Go to your legal people. Anyone here ever have to go through stuff like yearly ethics training, the online training stuff, right? Yeah, we do too. That's a great way to start doing things like training people up on incident response. It's amazing how much more effective and how much quicker you get stuff done when the guy on the other end you called up, he started 3 weeks ago, the IT guy, then you say, guys, we're in the middle of a critical incident on system XYZ, and immediately know what you're talking about, he immediately knows what you need. Instead of you spending another half hour trying to locate someone that actually knows what you're talking about, right? You've got to communicate this stuff. You've got to train. And for every asset, for every role defined, you need at least 2 contacts. Because almost absolutely guaranteed, the only guy in your place that knows something about the Exchange environment will be on vacation the week that you guys have a major breach in your Exchange environment, right? You've got to have that expertise available, primary, secondary, and even tertiary if you've got the resources available in your environment. You've got to have the right people that can answer these questions, and here again, all assigned to specific roles, all of them aware of their responsibilities. So, speaking of roles, a role at its lowest common denominator is essentially a list of job responsibilities. This person is our Exchange admin. This person is the incident management director. This person, their responsibility is marketing communications. This person's role is of legal support. Define each of those roles and responsibilities, and then start assigning people the roles. Don't start with Steve Smith is our incident management person, because guess what? As soon as Steve Smith leaves, the document needs to be changed. Any reasonably sized organization, there's always turnover. So define roles, then somewhere else assign individuals to each of those roles. So as the organization changes, guess what? Unplug that person, plug them in, and your process document doesn't need to change now. So do it based entirely on roles. And I've saved the best for last. Does anyone here believe they have the appropriate level of authority to get everything done that they're actually responsible for in their organization? Right? Nobody does. And I'll be honest, I honestly believe that's our fault. Because we take that. We accept that. You want to know the best way to get the right authority? Remember we talked earlier about the process definitions and roles? Define authority. What's necessary? Do you have the authority to say, guys, our customer database, CRM application is infected. We need to shut that down immediately and clean it up. Does anyone here think they could reach out a button and shut down your corporation CRM app? Probably not, right? Okay, you can. You're lucky. Everyone envy him. So you need to say, okay, guys, if we have a problem with our CRM application, who does have that authority to make the decision to shut that down, and what is the process? But document this, and don't just put the document and send it out to everyone. Get managers to sign it. Go to the team that runs the CRM. Guys, can the manager of this team, will you please sign on the bottom that you recognize that you're the only one that has the authority to shut this application down? And then guess what? You can now do a risk analysis that says, based on our process, we've got a gap of potentially 2 hours in here till we can get approval to shut down the CRM system. Go to management and say, guys, here's the risks we're sitting on because of these authority gaps. Are you comfortable with that? Because you remember, you're the one that might get fired, but they're the ones that have to go in front of the newspapers and explain what happened, right? Make them aware of exactly where the gaps are, where they reside, based on clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Once you start taking a structured approach like that and communicating it, it becomes a lot easier to start getting buy-up to do the things that need to be done in the event of emergency. Just going up and complaining about it in a meeting is never going to cut it. How many of you got to a meeting and said, we have to do this, and everyone goes, yeah, great idea, and nods their head and walks out, right? And then 6 months later, everyone's completely forgot about what they agreed to. Document, sign, communicate. And we technical geeks, we love our technology, but we have to get much better about those sorts of things if we're going to be able to do this effectively. Otherwise, we're going to keep getting hit with these problems and keep getting blamed when things go wrong. So axiom, if it's not documented and signed off on by management, pretty much guarantee it's not going to happen the way you want or expect it to. If it's signed off on and documented by management and someone fails to support their role adequately, and I hate to say CYA, but the reality is we've got this here, your manager agreed that we had the authority to do this, you're preventing it, you're generating risk for the organization, right? With that documentation, with a clear understanding, that process becomes much, much smoother. Who needs to be involved? Who needs to be trained up on some aspect or another of IT, of security incident management? You folks, obviously. You're the ones that are going to be in the driver's seat for this, right? More than likely, your CISO will take credit, if you're not a CISO, but whatever. IT operations, the guys that run the systems, that install the patches, they're the ones that you're going to have to be able to call up Heartbleed, right? Anyone here see the study of Heartbleed that came out a few months ago? 78% of the Fortune 2000 have not patched for Heartbleed yet. Right? Those are the guys that you as an IT security person need to be able to say, guys, we're sitting on Heartbleed risk on these 12 systems. You need to patch those immediately based on the roles, responsibility, and authority document. I can tell you to do that. If you refuse to do that, then we elevate to management, let them make the decision if they're comfortable with the risk. Right? Because you've defined that process already. Backup recovery team. I can't tell you how many places I've worked where the backup recovery team still sits behind a help desk ticketing app, right? You want to restore, submit a ticket, we'll get around to it, right? Anyone here think that's an adequate way to quickly recover from a multi-system malware infection, right? It's not. You've got to have a team that understands what the risks are, and if their process is broken, help them fix it. We'll talk more about that in a second. Disaster recovery. How many of you still have a separate disaster recovery team? Anyone? Most organizations are moving to this concept of high availability where it's built into underlying infrastructure, but whoever's responsible for that, you've got a disaster situation where your primary site is pretty much toasted entirely. You may end up reaching the decision, guys, we got to push the button on the disaster scenario right now to get back up and running, even if there hasn't been any kind of visible disaster. So help them understand under what conditions you may need to invoke their capabilities. Legal, we talked about them. They're the ones that are going to have to drive once a breach occurs. Application owners. Application owners, and here again, IT security, you folks are data custodians, right? You're not data owners. The owners of those applications, the owners of that data need to understand what it means to the business, what its risk impact is. And they have to communicate that to you in security so you can start making decisions. Why? Okay, I just got 2 alerts popped up on my screen. This one here involves some kind of SharePoint system. This one here involves some kind of Oracle database. What do I look at? Well, SharePoint system, my internal employees use for sharing recipes. Oracle is my customer order system. But if I don't know the difference between the two, I don't have a clue. These people need to communicate that to you, and they're the ones that you need to contact when you tell them, guys, you've been infected, your data may be corrupted, whatever's going on. They need to understand what you're talking about. Executives, all of our favorite people, right? They're the folks that sign the checks ultimately. Line of business application owners have part of the picture. Executives have the whole picture, right? How many of you have ever briefed executives in your organization? A bunch of hands go up. It's actually becoming more and more common these days. The security guys used to be the ones kept in the corner, break glass in case of emergency type thing. We're becoming much more mainstream, yay. But executives, here again, communicate with them, help them understand their role. Probably, in the last 5 years, every incident response I've been involved in, probably 20 to 30% of my time was spent explaining to executives what the hell was going on, because no one had bothered preparing them for the situation. And if you were here for the previous session, marketing. Marketing is the one that's going to have to put those press releases together when you've gotten breached or your product got compromised and back doors put in or whatever. Here again, marketing needs to have the information available. They need to have the understanding of what it is you're doing. So all these people need to be included in that process, plan, roles and responsibilities, and authority definition we talked about earlier. Clearly documented, clearly communicated, and trained. So axiom number 4. Any phone call and any meeting necessary during an incident management process geometrically increases the amount of time. How many of you have ever gone through a complete incident management process without a single meeting? Anyone? Actually do it on a regular basis back in my home corporation here at EMC. I'll give you an example. A couple months back, our security tool, we have a tool called ECAT, which you can hear about if you're interested, detected a new piece of malware on the Exchange server. We run clustered Exchange like everyone does, right? We found a piece of malware on the operating system, not in the data store itself. We detected it within about 10, 15 minutes of it showing up in the environment initially. Security ops guy picked up the phone, called the Exchange administrator, said, guys, you've got malware on this server. Exchange administrator went out, took a look. Yep, here's the malware. We run something called Recover Point, which is continuous data protection, continuous backup. Okay, this showed up 15 minutes ago, rolled the slider back on it, clicked the button, restored, rebooted the system. 20, 25 minutes from the time the malware showed up, the business was completely cleaned up and back up and running again. That's the sort of thing we're doing on a regular, daily, weekly basis now. Because we've eliminated the meetings, we've eliminated the phone calls. Management gets a roll-up report whenever they want to look at it on a dashboard to see how these things are happening and what's going on. That's the kind of process you need to shoot for. So let's take a look at some of the bits and bytes of the various supporting technologies necessary. Interesting thing, ESG did a study on tackling attack detection and incident response. And what they asked was, what were the biggest time sinks in incident response? If you look at these, determining the impact or scope, analyzing security intelligence, determining which assets, all of these tie back to having easy access to information, right? If you have to spend time digging for stuff, it's going to take you a lot longer to figure it out. So, based on Sun Tzu, everyone here's read Sun Tzu, Art of War, right? I actually prefer the Rumsfeld version. Right? Unknown unknowns. How many of you would be comfortable saying you've got complete, accurate, up-to-date information on everything in your infrastructure at your fingertips, right? Without making a phone call, without having to pull out a, God forbid, spreadsheet, right? That's what we need. But one of the results of that, I don't just mean infrastructure, we'll talk about the types of information here in a second, I'm going to speed up because I'm kind of running out of time, but we got to understand every event log, every application, everything happening in my environment. That's one of the reasons that, remember our comment about SIM is kind of long in the legs now, we're moving more towards a big data security analytics type approach. That's why. Crawford did a really interesting study a while back on data-driven security. When I saw hands going up earlier, it was probably better than half of you said you're getting overwhelmed with the volume of information you're trying to deal with, right? Security is becoming a big data analytics type problem because we are being overwhelmed and no one can afford enough eyes on glass to do this manually anymore. So what do we need? Infrastructure context. I can't tell you how many incident response projects or incident management projects I've been on where we ask a question like, well, we saw this unusual activity on the SIM system or an event log for this IP address. What does that belong to? We'll get back to you on that. 2 days later, someone finally figured out it was an old decommissioned UPS still sitting on the network no one's been talking to, right? If you don't have that information right in front of you immediately, guess what? More time for you to figure out what the impact is. More time for you to figure out what's going on. You know, we've had customers that get the good habit of every new system, part of their standard configuration is enabling event logs and sending them to the SIM system. The trouble is they never bother telling the security ops people that those logs are coming and what they mean and what they belong to. They literally, probably better than 50% of the logs coming into the SIM system, they don't have a clue what they're coming from or why they're coming. You've got to have infrastructure context documentation. You've got to have threat intelligence. Everyone here probably spends at least half of their day reading the blogs, the news sites, and everything else about all the latest cool security stuff out there, right? When you start getting into analytics and automated tools, you need a feed of that sort of information. You can't afford to sit there and try to understand everything happening manually. Once again, it's impossible to do. Security tool events. Every one of those security tools you've invested in, you've got to understand and use the information they're providing. I talked about the fact preventive won't stop, but the information they produce is still critical. Infrastructure events, all those event logs for every application, database, server, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, network session information. And I'm going to briefly talk about each of these, but once again, this needs to feed into an analytics type of tool that can make sense of it. Because if you recognize the fact for effective incident management that you really need access to all this information, and you aren't willing to admit there's no way in hell you're ever going to be able to manually deal with this volume of information, pretty much makes the case for itself that you need to have some sort of automated tool. That's where analytics comes into play. So I've talked about infrastructure context. We have a tool, and I apologize. Like I said, EMC RSA, I know our products. I don't necessarily know every product in the industry, so I'll use ours as an example, but I will tell you there's other vendors out there, obviously. We have a tool called Archer, GRC type tool, but at its core, it's a documentation system, right? Can't tell you how many times I've worked with customers to stand up Archer, and they populate it, and oh, this is great. I now have complete visibility into what my infrastructure looks like. Cool, we're done. And they walk away. Your environment never changes. Right? We need to tie into all the automated change control, all the processes out there so that every time anything changes in your environment, it's automatically updated. If you're relying on spreadsheets and manual update for your documentation, you've got more than 10 servers, you're pretty much going to get overwhelmed. We also need, remember my earlier example about the difference between a SharePoint site for sharing recipes and a customer order database? If you wait until an incident occurs to try to figure out what the value of stuff is, here again, you're going to be behind the 8 ball. It's called classification. Every asset in the environment needs to have a classification so you as a security professional immediately can stack rank your problems and address them in appropriate order based on the risk to the business. If you have to go out and ask for this after the event or the incident has started, here again, you're going to be well behind the 8 ball. Threat intelligence, I talked about that. You've got to have real-time feeds saying, these are the latest command and control servers, these are the latest drop locations, these are the latest types of malware, these are the latest indicators of compromise. Feed those into the tool, because unless you happen to be the fastest brain in the world and can read 1,000,000 miles per second, you're not going to be able to keep up with everything that's happening. Security tool events, I talked about those. The need to take your investment in security tools and feed that in so you can get the broader picture. Infrastructure events, those event logs I talked about. And you guys have got copies of the slides. And finally, network session information. How often have you identified a piece of malware that had to spend, 3 days trying to figure out how it got there? Think about it. If you're DVRing your network sessions, just go back, find out when the malware showed up, and replay the network session that put it there. You immediately know exactly what happened. It's another 2, 3, 4, 8, 10 hours of analysis you don't have to do anymore. Here again, security analytics type tools. So, direct correlation between how quickly you can access the information you need and how long your incident management process is going to take. You've got to be able to do it quickly and effectively. External communications. One of the things we're finding recently, a number of attacks, is the attackers were hooking into the primary network connections for the organization, and they were looking for keywords in emails, or emails going to the FBI telling someone, hey, we detected a breach, right? They're monitoring. They were doing things like blocking threat feeds coming into the environment so that, someone found out about it, they couldn't tell them about it. One of the things I always recommend for incident response, incident management teams, have a separate network connection not directly tied to your company. And by the way, this is not for your personal web browsing. This is not for eBay buying stuff. This is only for emergencies. But make sure it's segregated so that a denial of service or another kind of attack against your primary network, you still have the ability to communicate. High availability. We used to think in terms of something we call FTAMP or CTAMP, right? Ford truck access method, Chevy truck access method, back up a tape, throw it on a truck, drive it somewhere, drop it off, right? Slow and expensive. Give me an example. One of my primary jobs back when I first started with EMC was helping customers design disaster recovery solutions. Anyone ever done that for a living? A couple of hands go up. You walk into a customer and you ask the question, what are your availability requirements? Inevitably, the answer was, I need everything 100% available all the time. So the EMC sales rep that was sitting next to me would go, here's what that's going to cost you. And they would look at it and go, well, maybe not everything, right? What they would start doing is cherry picking. Here's my 10 critical business apps. Being a security guy, I would always ask the question, where's your security on that list? We'll worry about that once we got the business back up and running again. Customer down in, got hit by Katrina a couple years ago. They had a warm site in Oklahoma. Went back up. It only took us about a day and a half to get everything restored and running. About a dozen big critical applications. Went beautifully, smoothly. They had no backups of their security products, no installation media, one bare metal firewall sitting in a box at the site. Once we got the business apps up and running, we pulled the firewall, spent 2 more days trying to get the firewall configured. Couldn't figure the rules out. Management made the decision to pull the firewall out entirely. Every business app plugged directly to the internet because they had no capability to stand up security solutions. You need to start leveraging those high availability technologies, and in particular, you need to leverage them for your incident management. Anyone here think that the attackers are going to have pity on you because you just went through a disaster and they're going to take it easy and stop attacking you? Nope, they're coming full bore. You better be able to handle it no matter what the scenario is. Recovery. Every attack changes something in the environment. They compromise an account. They install malware. They enable a port. They do something in the environment, right? You've got to be able to get the environment back to a last known good point. That's where, guess what? Backup and restore type technologies come into play. Too often, that's treated as a separate thing. Us security people, we figure out the attack, these 10 systems, we throw it over the wall and say, you guys take care of it. And they have no clue what the relative impact is. You've got to have the right solutions, things like continuous data protection on your most critical assets, things like online backups on your second most critical assets, things like offline backups, whatever. Different scales of backup and recovery. Because remember, incident response has to become click a button, fix the problem, move on to the next one. or you're just not going to be able to keep up with modern times. If you got to submit 10 help desk tickets, which actually happened to me once at an incident response, we need these 10 systems restored to 2 hours ago. We got the malware. We identified these problems. Anyone here, by the way, think you'd be happy going through doing manual malware cleanup? Right? Anyone here read about the U.S. State Department's unclassified network? If you haven't, go out and Google it. Their unclassified network got infected. After 3 months of manual cleanup, they still had not gotten rid of all the infections. It's just too complicated to do that anymore. Last section is about lessons learned. I cannot tell you how many times we get called in for an incident. The first question I ask customers is, have you had incidents in the past? Yeah. How did you handle those? Well, the guy that was here left, and we're not sure. This is something new for us. Every time you do an incident, document what happened, who did what worked, what didn't. And I hesitate to use the term post-mortem just because of my earlier autopsy comment. But, right, that's essentially what it is. You need to go through, you need to review, you need to understand what happened. So everyone here, what's the guy's name? Leonardo, whatever, the author that quoted this, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. If you make a mistake during incident response and you don't document it, you don't review it, you don't fix it, guess what's going to happen? Next time you have an incident, you're going to probably make the same mistake. Don't do that. And quick summary, what we're doing is basically trying to stem a rising tide. The attackers are getting more sophisticated, they're getting faster. Velocity and volume, both are increasing in terms of attacks against us, right? We've got to shift this idea of incident response from being a cool technical project that, we stand at meetings and have briefings and do phone calls to we click a couple buttons, problem solved, move on. Business-driven process. And just like getting blamed for a breach, incident response, guess what? Your job is a very small piece of what happens. You're not the one that controls the infrastructure. You're not the ones that do the restore. You're not the ones that handle DR. You're not line of business. You're the one, however, that's going to be responsible for making sure all those moving parts work together smoothly, because once again, who's going to get blamed when an incident happens and you get breached? You are, right? Two more last slides I've done. It was interesting. I was flying back from Vegas last night. I was EMC World last week, and I was doing a little surfing, thank God for in-flight Wi-Fi, and it turns out KPMG actually published a report a couple years back that almost exactly mirrors what we've talked about here. And here again, you'll get a copy of this. You can Google it if you want to. But these are the top 5 reasons incident response fails in most organizations. You don't have the right skill set. You don't have the right people. You don't have management support. No clearly defined processes. No automated tools to support those processes. Data pertinent. Takes them too long to figure out what the hell's going on, right? And finally, everyone's favorite subject, and by the way, we don't use that word anymore. They're called organizational dynamics now. You don't have the authority. So KPMG agrees. And the last thing is a freebie for you. Have you ever heard of a term called FIDO, a tool? Netflix actually created it. It's a very, very cool incident response tool, and they just open sourced it last week. So how many of you here are using RTIR for incident response? There's always a couple of hands that go, whatever you're using. If you've got a smaller tool, you want some open source, take a look at FIDO. It's actually very cool. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Any questions, comments, bones, groans, just gripes? Anything? Yes?
I'm always wondering about the threat input part. Like, you have an attack, and now you see, okay, this was coming from Russia. My first question, what does it do different to coming from China? And the second question, what will you do against it anyway?
Very good point, and you're right. To a large degree, that makes a lot more of a difference to security companies like RSA who publish all these wonderful reports about China and stuff like that. From you as a business, probably doesn't matter in the slide. The one way it does make a difference, guys, we've got incoming network connections from Russia and from China. We have a remote office in China, but we don't have anything in Russia. That's probably a problem. So from that context, it's relevant. But like you said, you're not going to file a lawsuit against your organized crime group in Russia because they broke it in your thing. So there's some relevance there. It just depends on what it is. Anything else? Yes?
How detailed do you see people going into their process? So like when you talk about, our first step, contain.
Yep.
You can have one step and one line that says contain. You can use all the tools in your arsenal to change the firewall, monitor more, whatever.
His question about what level of detail do you go into for documenting the process? What I typically tell customers to do is pick a tool, a workflow automation tool, right? Build your process around that, and a lot of these tools are to some degree self-documenting. So you're defining the steps you have to go through. That gets pushed out. Use that as a starting point. Very, like you said, very basic document. Having a one-page document is better than having nothing, and review it regularly. Every few months. Guys, we've gone through 5 incident management process in the last few weeks. Let's sit down, take a look. All right, we weren't clear here. We need a little bit more detail. So start small, let it grow as it makes sense. It's much harder if you're dealing with a huge organization. You don't have anything, you're starting from scratch. Yes?
What are some automated workflow tools you recommend for the documentation process?
His question is, what are some automated workflow tools I recommend for that project, or for that? A lot of SIM tools have built-in instant response. And once again, I work for MCO, so I mentioned, we've got our Archer tool with a module called Advanced Security Operations that plugs right into it, that works with our security analytics tool that gives you workflow. RTIR is another one. That FIDO tool is actually fairly decent. All depends on size of the organization, budget, level of complexity you're looking for. But here again, make sure it's not, here's where the process is, because as soon as you get hit by a bus, your organization is basically screwed, right? So do something automated. Anything else? I'll be hanging around a while. Thank you all very much for taking the time.